So, just in terms of the topic, I think it's first apropos. Avraham Avinu, he came to understand God, the essence or the fact that there is a God at a very young age. The Rambam discusses the idea that some people can just look into nature, some people are more scientific, some people may be philosophical, and some people just need some real guidance and through the Torah itself. So everybody's an individual, and everyone's going to come to Hashem, come to the recognition of Hashem either on their own or not at all. And I guess that's part of the tonight's topic, the confused world of modern atheism. So I just want to read real quick two small paragraphs from a book called The Discovery Booklet, which I'm sure many people in this audience are familiar with. But these are two quotes. I'm going to shorten them up because they're quite long. One is by Leo Tolstoy. The other one is by Mark Twain. Really, the summary paragraph. So, after the news that we received this past week, from the President of the United States to, let's say, tell it like it is. It's just the reality. So sometimes that's how people see things. And most of the world, as we mentioned many times, it's an olam sheker. It's a world of illusion and lies. And sometimes when you're able to see, feel, experience, or know what's real, you're much better off. But everyone has to come in their own journey to where it's going to take them. So these are two famous people. There's many people that have similar quotes as I'm about to read. But Tolstoy says at the very end of some periodical Jewish World in London, 1908, the Jew is the emblem of eternity, to whom neither slaughter nor torture of thousands of years could destroy. He whom neither fire nor sword nor inquisition was able to wipe off the face of the earth. He who was the first to produce the oracles of God. He who has been for so long the guardian of prophecy and who transmitted it to the rest of the world. Such a nation cannot be destroyed. The Jew is as everlasting as eternity itself. And the end of Mark Twain concerning the Jews: the Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persians rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed, and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? So, look, you could just say, I believe in God, because the Jews are around. There's something that is unique, miraculous, supernatural, transcendent. You can go on and on. Something is, and I'm sure this is not what Rabbi Moshe is going to speak about. I couldn't even begin to think. But I have a feeling it's more on the scientific side. Anyway, so let me just give you his bio real quick, and then we'll get this over with and put him on the stage. Rabbi Moshe Averick has taught theology, spirituality, and religious philosophy for nearly 30 years. Many of his students have gone on to become educators and rabbinic leaders in North America, England, and Israel. He is known for his singular ability to explain complex topics in clear, understandable language, and, to borrow the description of one University of Chicago trained philosopher of science, his wicked sense of humor. Actually, I'm looking forward to that. Rabbi Averick ran educational programs at the UCLA and Northridge University in Los Angeles, and then became one of the founding faculty members of Aish Toronto and later at the Shalvim Rabbinical Seminary in Israel. He's the proud father and grandfather of 8 children and many grandchildren. Rabbi Averick was also a floor trader in the S&P pit at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and wrote and produced an album of spiritual acoustic rock, Feet on the Ground. He's the author of Nonsense of a Higher Order, The Confused World of Modern Atheism, distributed through Feldheim and available on Amazon. So please order the book. And without any further ado, Rabbi Moshe.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I know that it's a little bit maybe not so important to ask. Can everybody hear me all right? Is there any problem at all hearing? Okay, great. I have a paranoia about people hearing me. I'll tell you where it came from. It's kind of stuck in my head and never left. Back in the day, I know it's hard for you to imagine, but pretend you can see me with long, thick brown hair. And back in the day when I was an aspiring folk singer, I wanted to be a folk singer. Now, the younger people nowadays don't even know what a folk singer is. You'll have to consult with an anthropologist of ancient American music. But in any case, so I was a one-man, one-guitar act, and I used to very carefully, if I saw a great one-man act, I would go see it and watch very carefully to pick up pointers. This is really, at the time, this was my great ambition in life. Anyway, the best one-man, one-guitar performer I ever saw in my life was a country performer. He had traveled around the country circuit. He in the AAA, so he never made it to the big time. AAA country circuit, 8 years, living in the back of a UPS truck. That's what he lived in. 8 years, traveling around the country, and he was incredible. Anyway, after the show, I spoke to him. I said, I was waiting, like the master, the student sitting with the master. Please tell me, share me the secrets. And he looks at me like, this is a true story. He looks at me and he says, Sean, your show begins and ends with the sound system. That's what he said. That was 8 years of distilled wisdom, okay? Now, it may sound simplistic, but I found, and this is true, I found this was the most consistent, absolute rule in my performing that ever was. Lousy sound system, lousy show. Great sound system, lousy show. So, and the reason I'm telling you this story is so that you understand why I'm an aging, bald, Orthodox rabbi talking about God as opposed to a inappropriately funkily dressed for my age guy with a guitar trying to sing "Blowing in the Wind," which maybe if the talk doesn't go so well, maybe we'll switch to folk music. In any case, okay, thank you for coming again, as I said. It's very important that we have to define what our topic is tonight, and it's also important to define what the topic is not. We are not talking about divine revelation tonight. We're not talking about the first chapter of Genesis, of Bereshit. We're not talking about science and Torah. None of that. That's all important stuff, but not for tonight. Tonight the topic is the existence of God. Okay, and particularly the existence of God the Creator. There's a lot of ways of approaching the concept of the existence of God. We're going to be speaking specifically about that, okay? It's important to keep that in mind. A lot of times, part of the reason why there's so much confusion around this topic is because people kind of conflate all those things together, and they are very, very separate. In any case, I also want to make it clear that although I am unequivocally confident in my position, and I'm unequivocally confident in the arguments that I'm going to present. And not only that, I may speak sharply, and I may speak harshly even about certain ideas of atheism and certain proponents of atheism. I don't want to, please, that's one thing, that's my talk. But when it comes to question and answers, I am very, very makpid, very, very careful. I will answer honestly, respectfully. I respect other people's opinions, even if I disagree. So please, nobody should feel uncomfortable or intimidated, if so be it, about asking questions. Please, okay? It's very, very important. Okay, so now.
Should questions stay at the end, or
Yeah, at the end, yeah. Unless if there is a really important point of information, like what you don't understand something, but questions will hold to the end and stuff, okay? There are three categories, main categories of issues that are dealt with in the book in terms of the actual arguments, if you'll call them that. The first section is called Origin of Life, Clear Scientific Evidence of a Creator. The second section is called Man's Search for Meaning and Spirituality, and the third section is called Atheism and Morality. Now, obviously, we can't cover everything tonight. We're really going to focus on the first one tonight, on Origin of Life. First of all, because I think it's the easiest to present and understand in a forum like this in a relatively short time. The second reason is because I have found, and I've been working thoroughly researching this, over the last 8 or 9 years. One of the things that the modern militant atheists love to do is to wave the banner of science in the face of what they look at as primitive, backward non-believers. In other words, many times a person like let's say Richard Dawkins or Jerry Coyne, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with these names, they will present themselves as rational, enlightened, educated, scientific, evidence-based thinkers, whereas someone like myself, they will kind of portray as, dancing around a fire under a full moon with animal bones, wearing a hat with buffalo horns. And I'm being very serious. That's sort of sometimes the way it's presented, okay? And sometimes the biggest problem is just leveling the playing field. I have no problem with somebody with different points of views, but don't come at me with that type of attitude. I'm not speaking to anyone here. I'm talking in general. So, in fact, what I'll try to show you is that, interestingly enough, it's really just the opposite. In order to embrace atheism, I would propose to you, you must take giant leaps of faith. Not only that, you even have to be anti-science and deny certain basic scientific realities. That may sound strange, but I hope as we go on, it'll become clear. Okay, so without further ado, let's move right into the topic. The papal-like authority in the world of modern atheism is a gentleman by the name of Professor Richard Dawkins. He's an Oxford-educated biologist. I would imagine a very accomplished biologist. In fact, if anyone has read some of his books, I've read a number of his books, his descriptions of the natural world, I actually am a little jealous of him. He has a grasp of the scope of what's going on in the natural world in a way that I'll probably never have in my whole life, and I wish I had it. Some of his descriptions of how different parts of animals work, like he has a description of how a spider spins a web, it's mind-blowing. In any case, but he is the one that many ideologically committed atheists look to as sort of this great authority figure. Now, he wrote a book about evolution called The Blind Watchmaker. And in The Blind Watchmaker, he says the following, and listen carefully to what he says, quote, "I could not imagine being an atheist at any time before 1859 when Darwin's Origin of the Species was published." I'm going to read that again. Listen carefully. "I could not imagine being an atheist at any time before 1859 when Darwin's Origin of the Species was published." Now, some of you might grasp immediately what he's talking about, but just in case, I want to present you with a very similar statement by another very well-known atheist ideologue. He's also a professor of biology. He's a professor of evolutionary biology at the University of Chicago. His name is Jerry Coyne. He happens to be, Richard Dawkins is not Jewish. Jerry Coyne's a nice Jewish boy. He writes like this. He wrote a very well-known book called Why Evolution is True. And on the very first page, he writes the following, quote, "If anything is true about nature, it is that plants and animals seem intricately and almost perfectly designed for living their lives. Squids and flatfish change color and pattern to blend in with their surroundings, becoming invisible to predator and prey. Bats have radar to home in on insects at night. Hummingbirds are far more agile than any human helicopter. What does all this seem to imply? A master mechanic, of course. Darwin himself raised the question of design before disposing of it in 1859. So he also, the year 1859, when Darwin published his theory, was a game changer. Okay. Now, what exactly does he mean? What he means is really very simple. If you don't already understand it. Before 1859, before there was this new explanation, anyone looking at the natural world, there wasn't any possible other conclusion that it was a creator. How could you possibly explain something as incredible as an eagle, the flight of an eagle, or the murmurations of starlings? You know that there is, just as an aside, I don't want to get too off track, you have to realize that the flight of birds leaves our most advanced flying machines in the dust. The only thing that we have on birds is we can fly higher and faster. But in terms of actual aerodynamic skill, an F-15 fighter bomber is positively primitive. So no one could honestly look at that and say, oh, it just happened by itself, until Darwin's theory came out. And then all of a sudden everything changed. As Dawkins himself writes the following, quote, Charles Darwin discovered a way in which the unaided laws of physics could, in the fullness of geological time, come to mimic design. It's an incredible idea. It mimics design. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. It's an astounding statement. And finally, just to sum it up, here is an article by a world-famous biologist by the name of Francisco Ayala. Also started off as a priest, abandoned that, became a biologist and a philosopher of science. He wrote an article for the National Academy of Sciences called Darwin's Greatest Discovery, Design Without Designer. It's an incredible idea. Okay, it's important to understand, the reason I'm emphasizing this, you need to understand that the entire edifice of respectable, intellectual, scientific, academic atheism rests on Darwinian evolution. You pull Darwinian evolution out of the picture. We're back in the old days where, as one writer put it, every village had its Meshuggah, every village had its drunk, and every village had its atheist. You know, there's Fred. Hey, that's Fred. He thinks it all happened by itself. There was this one guy who was okay, so you had the village atheist. Now it's respectable, it's scientific, it's academic. Okay, so now, I would imagine that any number of people sitting here are assuming that I'm going to launch into an attack on Darwinian evolution. Nothing could be further from the truth. Remember, our topic here is not the first chapter of Bereshit, of Genesis. Our topic is the existence of God, the Creator. And regarding that topic, existence of God, Darwinian evolution is completely irrelevant. And I say that again, it has zero relevance and zero bearing on the whole question. We don't need to even talk about it. And as a matter of fact, although personally, I happen to think personally that Darwinian evolution is a hopelessly inadequate explanation for the organized complexity of the living world. But for the purposes of our discussion, to keep things straightforward and simple, I am prepared to totally concede, for argument's sake, totally concede the theory of evolution as being true. We will consider it for the purposes of our discussion, and I do the same thing in the book, is the most wonderful, substantiated, proven theory that in the history of science. Okay? So we're going to assume the truth of Darwinian evolution. Okay, now, why do I say it's irrelevant? Why do I say it doesn't matter? For a very simple reason. First, let's give a quick a thumbnail description of Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is based on random mutations in the replication of the DNA of a living organism. Now, sometimes by pure luck, DNA is digitally encoded information that has all the information needed to build the things that the cell needs to live. And there's a lot, this has to be copied. There's sometimes copying mistakes. They're called mutations. And sometimes by pure luck, these mistakes confer a slightly different configuration for the organism, giving it a slight survival advantage. Ostensibly, that will make it more likely to pass it on to its offspring. And these little changes over millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years, they all add up. And from the original microscopic bacteria, here we are sitting on Rehov Yael in Baca. Okay? That's in a nutshell. Okay? So now, surprise. Darwinian evolution is only relevant and operative from the moment life begins and forward. Okay? It's very important to realize that. In other words, before Darwinian evolution can take place, and we've assumed it for argument's sake, you need a fully functioning living cell with a DNA-based genetic system and all the molecular machinery that a cell needs to live, and then you can go forward and evolve into all these different types of life forms, right? Only after life begins, and by the way, that is not a scientifically controversial statement. That everybody understands. Darwinian evolution does not even pretend to account for the existence of the first bacterial cell, which is the so-called simplest and oldest known living organism that exists. By the way, did I mention that we're going to assume we're not going to deal with the issue of age of the universe either? We're going to sidestep that. We're just going to, as far as Torah's view, we're just going to deal with modern, scientific cosmology, okay, and modern, the way the number of years that they talk about. So, as Richard Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion, that was his atheist magnum opus, he says like this, quote, Darwinian evolution proceeds merrily once life has originated. But how does life get started? End of quote. Yes, Professor Dawkins, that's the question. How does life get started? And that is not a small question at all, because when you understand what a bacterial cell is, when you understand that a bacterial cell contains technology beyond anything that is within the capabilities of our technology today to reproduce. It could be one day we'll be able to build a cell, but not today. Where did it come from? I'm going to read you very briefly. I don't want to take up too much time, but you have to understand what the issue is here. This is written by Dr. Paul Davies of Arizona State University. He is a non-believer. I think he recently came out of the cause as an actual atheist, as opposed to a deist. He believed that God created things but then left it alone. I don't know what exactly his theology is. And also Dr. Michael Denton, who is an Australian geneticist and microbiologist. Quote, the living cell is the most complex system of its size known to mankind. Its host of specialized molecules execute a dance of exquisite fidelity, orchestrated with breathtaking precision. How can mindless molecules, capable of only pulling and pushing their immediate neighbors, cooperate to form something as ingenious as a living organism? Scientists have fabricated invisible cogwheels, motors the size of a pinhead, and electrical switches as tiny as individual molecules. The burgeoning field of nanotechnology, building structures and devices measured on a scale of billionths of a meter, promises to revolutionize our lives. But we should not lose sight of the fact that nature got there first. The world is already full of nanomachines. They are called living cells. Each cell is packed with tiny structures that might have come straight from an engineer's manual. Minuscule tweezers, scissors, pumps, motors, levers, valves, pipes, chains, and even vehicles abound. Although the tiniest living things known to science, bacterial cells, are incredibly small, each is a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of elegantly designed pieces of machinery, more complicated than any machine built by man and without parallel in the non-living world. What we would be witnessing would be an object resembling an immense automated factory. However, it would be a factory which had one capacity not equal in any of our own machines, for it would be capable of replicating its entire structure. And Dr. Denton goes on to describe the cell as, quote, the complexity of a jumbo jet packed into a speck of dust, invisible to the naked eye. Moreover, it is a speck-sized jumbo jet which can duplicate itself quite easily. Now you have to realize what this means. A Xerox machine, you put a color photograph, it gives you a perfect copy of a color photograph. What we're talking about here is a Xerox machine that makes another Xerox machine. Now wouldn't that be something, right? You leave a jet airplane in the hangar, and next morning you come back, there's two of them. That is beyond the wildest engineering dreams that we have today. And yet it happens trillions and trillions of times a day on a microscopic level. Okay? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about how the living cell got there. I just want to make also one comment. Most people don't really understand what DNA is. Besides all this nanotechnology, DNA is the genetic code which contains the information for building the machinery that the cell needs. Let me give you this quote again. These are from people who, by the way, all disagree with me. I want to tell you something. No, I'm serious. When I wrote the book, when I started doing the research for the book, as soon as I discovered that somebody agreed with me, I would refuse to read anything that he wrote. I only did research based on people who are on the other side of the argument. Okay? It's very important. This is Dr. Paul Davies, who, although is a world-renowned expert on origin of life, he's devoted the last 35, 40 years of his life to it. He's the head of the Origins Institute at Arizona State University. Listen to what he writes about DNA. Quote, the living cell is best thought of as a supercomputer, an information processing and replicating system of astonishing complexity. DNA is not a special life-giving molecule, but a genetic data bank that transmits its information using a mathematical code. Most of the workings of the cell are described as information or software. Trying to make life by mixing chemicals in a test tube is like soldering switches and wires in an attempt to produce Windows 98. It won't work because it addresses the problem at the wrong conceptual level. And finally, just to quote Bill Gates in his book, The Road Ahead, he said, DNA is like a software program, but far, far more advanced than anything we've ever created. DNA is literally, in fact, if anything, I'm understanding it, it is the most sophisticated digital information processing system in the known universe. So now, where did it come from? In other words, what you have to understand now is that once this machinery is in place, Darwinian evolution can move forward. So, what happens here is there's a paradigm shifting insight. Because what it turns out is that not only is Darwinian evolution not the cause and not the explanation of the staggering complexity and sophistication on life of this planet, Darwinian evolution is a process which is the result of the staggering complexity and sophistication of life on this planet. In other words, once you have in place fantastic machinery, fantastic things can happen. But the notion that fantastic machinery can do fantastic things was never really a point of contention, was it? What is the question that is the point of contention? Where does fantastic machinery come from in the first place? Darwinian evolution does not answer the question at all. And by the way, it is a bitter pill to swallow. Sooner or later, the non-believers are going to have to accept this. Right now they're protected by a heavily atheistic academic establishment, but they're going to have to eventually accept this bitter pill that all the writings of guys like Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne and P.Z. Myers and Victor Stenger and all the rest, touting Darwinian evolution as the solution to not believing in God, they have done nothing but present us with the grandest of tautologies. In other words, they have explained the amazing complexity of living organisms by invoking processes that are based on the amazing complexity of living organisms. That's all it is. So now, by the way, I want you to know, I'm not the only one to notice this, okay? Here is Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel is a highly distinguished philosopher at New York University, an avowed atheist, also a nice Jewish boy. He happens to be a very candid atheist, by the way. Very honest, very straightforward, but 100%. He says, I am just as much an outsider to religion as Richard Dawkins. He writes like this, quote, the entire apparatus of evolutionary explanation therefore depends on the prior existence of genetic material with these remarkable properties. Since the existence of this material, or something like it, is a precondition of the possibility of evolution, evolutionary theory cannot explain its existence. We are therefore faced with a problem. We have explained the complexity of organic life in terms of something that is itself just as functionally complex as what we originally set out to explain. So the problem is just pushed back a step. How did such a thing come into existence? Dr. Paul Davies, quote, the replicative machinery of life is based on the DNA molecule, which is itself as structurally complicated and intricately arranged as an automobile assembly line. If replication requires such a high threshold of the complexity in the first place, how can any replicative system have arisen spontaneously? End of quote. And one last one, Dr. Adi Pras, he's professor of chemistry at Ben Gurion University, quote, despite the widespread view that Darwinian evolution has been able to explain the emergence of biological complexity, that is not the case. Darwinian theory does not deal with the question how life was able to come into being. The troublesome question still in search of an answer is, how did a system capable of evolving come about in the first place? By the way, it's only a troublesome question if you assume that somehow it happened by itself. If you assume what might be the obvious intuitive reaction that it was created, well, it's not a troublesome question at all. It's obvious, right? Okay. So now, the question now that we have to ask is, the issue of where this original life came from is the domain of a fundamentally and conceptually separate area of science called origin of life research. Okay? How are scientists doing in the origin of life research? Well, how would you expect them to be doing? You know, the example I always give people is, you know, the Lego set for the Brooklyn Bridge contains 853 pieces. Each of those pieces is specifically designed and engineered to build a model of the Brooklyn Bridge. Let's say a Nobel Prize winning scientist announced he's undertaking a project. I'm going to investigate how it's possible to find a path from these 853 pieces to a model of the Brooklyn Bridge using only natural unguided forces. Wind, rain, lightning, cosmic rays, volcanoes, running water, thermal energy, anything you want to guess. What would you think if somebody announced such an investigation? You'd think they'd lost their mind probably. And they're doomed to failure. There's no way you're going to do it. You know that it can't possibly happen. So now, what would you expect if somebody says, I'm investigating how it's possible through an entirely unguided naturalistic process to come up with the most sophisticated nanotechnology in the universe and the most sophisticated digital information processing system in the known universe? How are they doing on this project? And the fact is, the progress in origin of life research is exactly what you'd expect for undertaking a project that is so absurd and so ridiculous and so nonsensical as thinking that life could start by itself. I'm just going to read you again. In the book, I have 83 quotes running from 1859 to 2015, which cover, and with many Nobel Prize winning scientists, but I'm just going to give you a few. 2016. Professor James Tour, a lecturer at University of Waterloo. James Tour happens to be, he's a professor of chemistry, Rice University. He's one of the top 10 most cited chemists in the world. He is a world-class synthetic chemist. Quote, there is collective cluelessness. Those who say this is well worked out, they know nothing about chemical synthesis. Those who think that scientists understand the details of life's origin are wholly uninformed. Nobody understands. When will the scientific community confess to the world that they are clueless on life's origin, that the emperor has new clothes? Eugene Koonin, who is a very respected microbiologist in Washington, also has been, for the last several decades, working on origin of life. He wrote in his book in 2011, quote, the origin of life field is a failure, end of quote. Lee Hartwell, Nobel Prize winner, 2011, quote, with respect to the origin of life, I find the more we learn about cells, the more complex they seem. They are just incredibly complex things, and to go from what we can see today and try to reason where it came from, I think is really impossible. Paul Davies, who I mentioned several times, in a lecture at 2010, quote, how, he says, he was speaking to the audience, he says, how, meaning how did life begin? We haven't a clue, end of quote. Franklin Harold, molecular biologist, Colorado State University, 2001. Quote, the origin of life appears to me as incomprehensible as ever, a matter for wonder, but not for explication. And finally, Hubert Yaki, physicist, renowned information theorist, 1981, quote, since science does not have the faintest idea how life on Earth originated, it would only be honest to confess this to other scientists, to grantors, and to the public at large. Not only has origin of life research been a complete failure, not only has it literally not progressed at all since 1859, that doesn't tell you the story. It's gone backwards by many orders of magnitude. And if we plot origin of life research on an XY graph, the X graph represents the understanding of how life could begin through a naturalistic process. 1859, 0. 2017, 0. Cluelessness. But that doesn't tell the whole story. On the Y graph, we're plotting the understanding since 1859 of the magnitude of the problem you're trying to solve. See, in 1859, it was down near 0 because they didn't really have a profound understanding of what a living cell was. But with the breakthroughs in biochemistry and microbiology and genetics, in 2017, the Y-axis is off the graph, which means they're getting further from the answer, not closer to the answer. And finally, you understand now why John Horgan, who was a senior writer for Scientific American, an anti-intelligent design person, by the way, he wrote the following, quote, he said, if I were a creationist, I would cease attacking the theory of evolution and focus instead on the origin of life. This is by far the weakest strut of the chassis of modern biology. The origin of life is a science writer's dream. It abounds with exotic scientists and exotic theories, which are never entirely abandoned or accepted, but merely go in and out of fashion. Now, when he says, by the way, the chassis of modern biology, what he means, of course, is the chassis of atheistic biology, a view of biology that leaves God entirely out of the picture. That's what he means. It's the weakest strut. But in fact, that's not accurate. It's not true that it's the weakest strut. It is a strut that doesn't exist at all, which leaves it cluelessness. There is no understanding of origin of life, which means the entire edifice of atheistic thought rests on thin air and wishful thinking. You have to take a leap of faith that somehow it happened, somehow. Okay? In the question and answer period, we can talk about it more. So where does this leave us? And with this, we're going to conclude. It leaves us really right back where we started from. It leaves us with molecular machinery that is so fantastic that, in the words of University of Chicago microbiologist James Shapiro, quote, it outstrips scientific description. It leaves us with this astoundingly complex molecular machinery of life with no clue to explain its origin. In other words, for Jerry Coyne and Richard Dawkins, it leaves us in 1858. Evolution didn't change anything. We're right back. We're looking at in the incredible complexity of life, no explanation, nothing to explain it. In other words, where it leaves us is that for the rational truth seeker, there is only one possible conclusion, and that is that life was created. Now, what I've presented here is a kind of a scaled-down version of the argument. In the book, the Origin of Life section is well over 100 pages. But in any case, the most important part of the evening, I look forward to any comments and questions, and I thank you very much for listening. Yes?
I've heard an argument, that is from my son, and I also read it in George Schroeder's book,
Right.
George Schroeder, the nice Jerusalemite, that everything came from one cell, and that cell replicated, multiplied,
Right.
became an eye, became a human being, became an elephant, became a thing. And first of all, George Schroeder tries to show that it's impossible. There hasn't been enough time in the world, and we're talking not about 5,000 years, we're talking about 160 billion years or whatever it is.
Right.
But it's impossible. But even then, who created that first cell? So
Well, in other words, what I think Gerald, I'm not talking, we're going to leave evolution aside here. I'm talking about, what Gerald Schroeder was talking about is that the amount of time for the first living cell to form, because the Earth cooled off only a certain amount of years ago. The oldest life is somewhere they have discovered between 3.3 and 3.8 billion years ago. What's a few hundred billion years between friends? But and the Earth only cooled down a little bit before that. There is a very tiny window of time for that first living cell to form, and of course, it's absurdly improbable. We'll get into that, maybe depending on what questions asked, we'll get into more of that, how, because obviously I'm not the only one to notice these things. The other side, atheists, polemicists also are very aware of this, and obviously they have their approach to dealing with it. But in any case, are there any more questions? Yes, this gentleman right here.
Yeah, so just some background. So I'm a PhD student in neuroscience.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. I appreciate the fact that you engage with these issues. I think that the fundamental issue with sort of the direction that you argument is the assumption that, so given that science has not come very far in terms of the origins of life.
Right.
But that doesn't entail God. In other words, in science there are a lot of things that we don't know. Like in neuroscience, I would say that we know less than 1/100th of 1% of what there is to know about the brain.
Right.
The fact that we have a lack of knowledge doesn't mean that you jump to the conclusion, therefore I'm an intelligent designer. It just means that we need to do more work, and we might need a revolutionary breakthrough, something like evolution in the time of Darwin, or something. There were lots of revolutionary ideas in the history of science where people had no idea how things work, and then we figured it out. DNA is an example. There are all sorts of examples, Newtonian physics, relativity. So it's, there's no reason for me to believe that what's missing in terms of origin of life research is just another breakthrough like that. And just from the standpoint of, how it could come about. So again, I think that you're correct that currently we don't necessarily know. But I think that in the world of, so I also come from a background of artificial intelligence, which deals with solving optimization problems, right? So you have, let's say that you want to recognize faces, or you want to design a robot that's able to walk or something like that. So it turns out that you can write a very, very simple algorithm based on very simple principles that if you give it enough time, and here we're only talking on the order of hours or days, you can actually get it to an optimal solution. And one of the classes of algorithms within artificial intelligence is something called genetic algorithms, which is actually based on the principle of evolution. And within an hour, I can personally write a genetic algorithm that's based on the principles of crossover and mutation, and there's no DNA involved, it's just flipping bits. And I can get it to solve a very difficult problem that if I were just doing random search, it would take me basically forever. So the idea that it's necessary to have DNA in order to create complexity and in order to achieve an optimal solution, I just don't think that's necessarily true from a scientific perspective, because I think that we have examples of simple systems that if you know the right rule, and these rules aren't necessarily
If you know the right
right rules. By which I mean what we call learning rules. So in genetic algorithms, again, it's just the principle of evolution, right? You just kill off the solutions that are bad and you have some random mutation. And so I think that there are in principle mechanisms by which that kind of complexity can arise without asserting an intelligent designer.
Right, okay. So, I mean, you said a bunch of different things here. I mean, you mentioned a bunch of different points. The first thing is all the algorithms and all the thing, your solution, you're talking about, you're the one doing it, an intelligent creator. You're writing the program. You know what you're looking for. You know that you're looking for a solution to a particular problem. When you have a swamp with a bunch of chemicals in it, they don't know anything. You're just mixing up chemicals one after the other. So you can't even begin to compare. And by the way, you can't compare that. You are talking about a completely random process. Dump a bunch of chemicals in a swamp, and tell me how you're going to end up with a digital information processing system loaded with a digitally encoded information. How are you possibly? No, wait. Let me answer. I heard what you said. That's the first thing. It can only come from a completely random process, which of course is absurd. It's absurd. It's absurdly improbable. Secondly, you didn't realize that's the reason why I read in the beginning. I could not imagine being an atheist before 1859. The idea that living organisms could happen by themselves before Darwinian evolution was incomprehensible. Only a few, like I said, you had the village atheist. Scientifically, it made no sense whatsoever.
I'm not sure. I mean, like in Greek philosophy.
Wait. What's your name?
Tuvia.
Tuvia. Okay, Tuvia. Go tell it to Richard Dawkins. He was the one who said it. What did Jerry coin, who was a zealous atheist? He said, before Darwin, the obvious implication was a master mechanic. Of course. What else would you conclude? Now, you should also know something else. There is a very interesting, you haven't really grasped, in my opinion, you haven't really faced up to the fact that that all the things you're talking about are after you have complex systems in place to perform all the things that you want. You don't realize you're starting with a swamp. Robert Shapiro, who was the professor of chemistry at NYU, he said the following. He said, I don't know that much about, he's a world-class chemist and an expert on origin of life. He says, I don't know that much about Darwinian evolution, but I have no reason to doubt my other scientific colleagues who talk about it as if it's really true. So I'm going to assume that they're right. He said, however, the debate about intelligent design is not really focused on Darwinian evolution. It is the origin of life where the real problem comes in. He said because the gulf between a mixture of simple chemicals, even with a bunch of amino acids, the gulf between that and a bacterium is much more profound than the gulf between a bacterium and an elephant. Lynn Margulis said the exact same thing. She said that it is a bigger step to go from a mixture of chemicals to a bacterium than it is to go from a bacterium to a human being.
I understand
I didn't finish. I didn't finish my answer to you. I'm going to finish my answer. There is a very well-known philosopher of science named Dr. Iris Fry. She's at Tel Aviv University and the Technion. She wrote a seminal paper called about the philosophy of origin of life research. She said there's basically two camps. Okay? She said there is the camp, what she calls the continuity thesis, meaning that there is the camp of researchers who hold that there must be an unbroken gap between non-living things and living things, meaning there is some natural process we haven't discovered yet that inevitably will lead to a living organism. That's one camp, okay? The other camp, she says, that's a philosophical position. It has no experimental basis. It has no evidence for it. It's a philosophical presupposition, she calls it. Okay. Number two, the other camp. She calls the other, you know what she calls the other camp? The almost miracle camp. Okay? Who are some of the proponents of the almost miracle camp? Francis Crick, Nobel Prize-winning scientist, the one who discovered DNA. Jacques Monod, Nobel Prize-winning biochemist. Ernst Mayr, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists of the 20th century. Sir Karl Popper, okay, and others. The almost miracle camp. What's the difference? Okay, why is it that what is the basis for the people who say that there is this continuity thesis, that there must be a path? On what is it based? It's not based on any experimental evidence at all, because as we've seen, the origin of life field is a complete failure. You know what it's based on? A leap of faith. That's what a philosophical presupposition is. It's a leap of faith. It's an article of faith. I accept it, no evidence. I accept it because that's the way I want it to be. It's an article of faith. And what about the almost miracle camp, she says? Why do they hold it's almost a miracle? Because they have concluded that there is no way that there's a natural process to go from chemicals to a living cell. Therefore, the only possibility is what? Is blind chance. And therefore, it's like a miracle. We got lucky. You know what Jacques Monod said? He said, "Lucky for us, our number came up in the Monte Carlo game." That's what he said. You know what Francis Crick said? He said, "Life is a happy accident. We got lucky." That's all there is to it. Which, of course, is ridiculous. So now, because astoundingly improbable things don't happen. So you take your choice. You have your degree in neuroscience. I'm talking about the people actually doing the origin of life research. You have two choices. You either take it as an article of faith. And by the way, you think that scientists don't take leaps of faith? Harold Urey, you know who Harold Urey was? Nobel Prize-winning chemist. You know who his student was? Stanley Miller. You know who Stanley Miller was. Harold Urey was the mentor of Stanley Miller. Harold Urey in 1962, this is 9 years after the famous experiment. He said, those of us who study the origin of life, we can't believe that it ever actually could have possibly happened. We all accept it literally as an article of faith. That is the term that he used. You don't think that scientists have to take article of faith? You know what Chandra Wickramasinghe said when he undertook with Sir Fred Hoyle to study the origin of life in Sir Fred Hoyle's later years? He said he started off as an atheist. He realized it's impossible. There's no way it could have happened by itself. You know what he said? He said, I was brainwashed from my earliest days as a scientist. You can't talk about God. You can't talk about creation. He says, I'm very uncomfortable, but there was no choice. There's no way out of it. So, you want to stay in neuroscience? That's perfectly fine. You want to go into origin of life? Take your pick. Take an article of faith, or believe in almost miracles, believe in astoundingly improbable blind luck. Those are the two choices. Anyway, yes. I'll give you one last chance to make a comment. I will give you the last word.
Okay, so I mean, like you said a lot of things also, so I'm trying to figure out which point to respond to. And I'm also not sure that you responded to my first point about the therefore God thing. So I think that I would prefer.
What I was saying is I basically hold the same thing as Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne. Once you don't have evolution, you're stuck with the obvious creation. That's all.
So I'm not interested in arguments from authority about what we said. Like I understand that people like Richard Dawkins. Personally, I don't think that he's necessarily the most important scientist in biology. He's very outspoken. You know? but I'm more sort of just like I know that in my field and I know that in science and I know that in science in general. Again, the idea that sometimes we have no idea about how something works until there's a breakthrough. And so the fact that you have a lot of people who think that something is miracle and think that something is completely non-understandable, that doesn't mean that in another 50 or 100 years there won't be a breakthrough and then all of those people will have egg on their faces, because that happens all the time in science. So it doesn't, the fact that a lot of famous people and a lot of
it could happen. They could come up with a perpetual motion machine too. I mean, you don't know, right? Maybe. You see, you're saying maybe. Maybe answers all questions. Maybe means you don't have to ever make a decision because maybe.
No, but I don't. Why should you have to make a decision? In other words, there are things in the universe that you don't understand, and that's okay.
Right.
That's okay for science.
Right. I'm not here to twist your arm. If you're willing to live with maybe this astoundingly improbable event happened, maybe, you wouldn't say, what I would suggest is you would never say it for anything else. But for this, people are prepared to say it.
Scientists, I say it for everything. And my entire life is maybe.
This watch happened by itself? Would you say it?
For that, no. But
No. Well, what do you mean? A bacterial cell is a million times more complex and sophisticated.
But artificial complexity is different from natural complexity, right? There are two
Why?
categories of things.
Well,
There are
it's not different at all. It's not different at all.
That's a claim that you're making. Right?
How is it different? I'm going to give you one last chance. Tell me how it's different. How is it different?
Well,
How is the complexity of a bacterial cell? Why is it fundamentally different than the complexity of a watch?
So I don't think that they're ontologically different. I think that they are different in the sense that they come from different origins, right? I think that a watch is complex, and I think that.
But you don't know what the origin of a bacterial cell is.
Music is complex, but the watch is made by a watchmaker, and the music is made by a musician, right? So there are different processes that create different kinds of complex things. So the same applies to artificial things and natural things, right? They're just different categories of things created by different processes.
Okay. I mean, you're saying that arbitrarily, but that's what I think. You're making an arbitrary difference, and there really is no difference. A digital information processing system is a digital information processing system. Okay, so, I mean, we disagree, and, look, we got to think about it. I would suggest you read the book because really, see, this is what you're bringing up is really, most of the objections of atheists are not scientific because science has no answer whatsoever. They're all philosophical, like you're bringing up. And I deal with the philosophy. I didn't have time to go into it. I deal with the philosophical objections. It's important. But in any case, I hear what you said. I want to take some other questions, so thank you very much. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the God particle, the Higgs boson?
I don't know anything about the Higgs boson, and so therefore I can't really talk about it. I don't know that. I don't know that much about it. I don't know what to tell you.
Because it's the first time I've ever heard of anything that even approaches scientifically proving the existence of God.
I don't really know. I'm not enough up on physics to make any meaningful comment on it.
It's a name that's useful for advertising.
Yeah, I think it personally, after reading, I have an article here called Atheists Are Waiting for the Darwinian Origin of Life Messiah. Every so often, the science writers are into hype. They've got to sell their articles, and they usually overhype things. A lot of times when you actually know what's going on, it's not really as big a deal as the science writers make it out to seem. You should know that. There was a very famous case with a guy named Jeremy England. How many people here have heard of Jeremy England? Okay, you haven't heard of him, I'm not going to talk about it. Very much. Yes, do you have a question about what? Yes, who they claim had come up with this theory that was completely gonna.
And he said that's not what I said.
Yeah, well, if you actually read what he said and what actually was going on, it was like you wouldn't even know that he was talking about origin of life at all. But in any case, that's so a lot of it's hype. I'll be very honest with you. I've discovered that. Yeah. Any other? Did you want to say something about? Oh, this gentleman. Let me this gentleman back here. Yes.
Just to piggyback a little bit on what you
Right.
were saying, you said it very eloquently.
Right.
Maybe I'm a simpleton. I just don't understand. What is the? I understand the improbability of just a spontaneous combustion. I read Lawrence Krauss's book of the Universe of Nothing. While I was reading it, made sense. I can't describe to you what his theoretical,
Right.
World was. But what is the evidence that it's that's a creator?
Well, in other words, like this. In other words, I'll try to briefly give you kind of the philosophical, the syllogism here. Everyone in this room is absolutely certain that this watch was made by a watchmaker. Everyone in this room, okay? In fact, you are so certain that this watch was made by a watchmaker, you are as certain that that is true as 2 + 2 = 4, which is about as certain as you can get about anything in this world, right? So the question is, why are you so certain? How are you so certain of that? Okay, now, 1 second. You didn't see this watch being made. There's some people say experience, though they have this philosophical idea. It's experience. It's not experience. There's no one in this room who experienced this watch being made. So how do you know it's true? Well, I know from experience that there are watches that are made by watchmakers. So what? Then you're saying that's in philosophy called an argument from analogy. You're saying, since I know there are people who make watches, and this one is like those other watches, it must be that this one was also made. Maybe. In philosophy, an argument from analogy is one of the weaker arguments. It's sort of all in the eyes of the beholder. So then, and it's certainly not 2 + 2 = 4. So then how are you so certain 2 + 2 = 4 that this was made by a watchmaker? And the answer is very simple. And I'm going to read to you, I'm trying to answer your question. I normally wouldn't do this, but I'm going to read you the actual explanation written by an atheistic physicist by the name of Dr. Leonard Susskind. He's at Stanford University. Listen carefully. This is how you know that this was made by a watchmaker as certain as 2 + 2 = 4. Listen. Quote. Oh, by the way, this is in a book that Leonard Susskind wrote. It's called The Black Hole War. My Battle with Stephen Hawking to Make the World Safe for Quantum Mechanics. That's quite a mouthful, huh? Okay, he writes like this, quote, "It would be a bad idea to park your BMW in the rainforest for 500 years. When you came back, you'd find a pile of rust. If you left the pile of rust for another 500 years, you could be pretty sure it wouldn't turn back into a working BMW. That, in short, is the second law of thermodynamics." By the way, he's one of the fathers of string theory. He is a very prominent physicist, okay? Both the BMW and the rust heap are a collection of about 10 to the 28 atoms. That means 10 multiplied by itself 28 times, a 1 followed by 28 zeros. That's a very big number. 10 to the 28 atoms. Mostly iron. Imagine that you took those atoms and threw them together randomly, meaning you just applied natural forces to them. What is the likelihood they would come together to form a working automobile, meaning a functionally complex machine? I think we can all agree it would be extremely unlikely. If you imagine all the possible ways you could assemble the atoms, the overwhelming majority of the arrangements would look like rust heaps. If you shook up the atoms of a car, you would be much more likely to get a pile of rust because there are so many more rust pile arrangements than car arrangements. And just one last paragraph. Here is another example, okay? This is not me, this is Leonard Susskind. Here is another example. An ape banging away at a typewriter will almost always type gibberish. Very rarely will he type a grammatically correct sentence. What's more, if you take the letters of a meaningful sentence and shake them up like tiles in a Scrabble game, the result will almost always be gibberish. The reason? There are a lot more nonsensical ways to arrange 20 or 30 letters than there are meaningful ones. If you want to just get an idea of how many ways, let's say you have a sentence that consists of 50 letters, okay? At each of those 50 letters, how many different letters could you put in each of those spaces? 26 different letters. How many different combinations are there? 26 to the power of 50. The number 26 to the power of 50 is beyond our comprehension. Okay? If you want to understand how big that number is, the number of atoms in the entire universe is 10 to the power of 80. That's atoms in the whole universe. 26 to the power of 50 is in that type of category. It's certainly more atoms than there are in the Milky Way galaxy. That's how many combinations you are. That's why you know, by the way, when you walk into the kitchen and you have magnetic letters and it says, "I'll be home late, dear, I put meatloaf in the freezer," you know that somebody arranged those letters. You know why? Because for it to have happened randomly, there's just too many possible combinations for it ever to come out like that. That's how you know. And you want to know something? 1 second. I'll just conclude and then you can comment. That's why you are absolutely certain that this watch was made by a watchmaker. Because if you took the parts of this watch and you applied random forces to them, what would be the probability that they'd come together to form a working watch? Almost essentially zero.
Highly improbable.
Exactly. What would be, you know how many atoms there are in a bacterial cell? You're talking about 1 trillion atoms. What is impossible? Nonsense. It is complete nonsense to assume. That's how you know. And that's why this gentleman, I forgot, Tuvia, there is no difference between, it's the same principle. There's just too many parts, too many different combinations. And by the way, you want to know something even more? The first one I noticed who actually identified the argument properly was Richard Dawkins. He said it's the argument from improbability that is the biggest challenge to atheists. The argument, that's what this is. That's all. Okay, so in other words, that's how you know it was a creator. Because functionally complex machinery doesn't happen by itself. It's too improbable. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I think my question wasn't complete because you're coming at it, I'm assuming, from an orthodox point of view.
I'm coming at it from a rational point of
So
view.
from a rational point of view, for
Right.
you to make for you to say something is highly unlikely, I think it's even more highly improbable that all of the occurrences of the Old Testament would have occurred by the hand of the same creator.
Remember what I said at the beginning. What's our topic? The existence of God the Creator. We're not here to talk about divine revelation.
You're right, and I think that's why that was a little.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something else.
It still seems highly improbable.
I'll tell you something. Yeah, it's highly improbable that life could have happened by itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It goes both ways.
And I'll tell you one last story, and then we'll get Rabati will get ask your question. The first time I ever spoke about origin of life, I was invited by the Secular Student Society of Elmhurst College. Okay. Now, I had never spoken about this. I was in the middle of writing the book, and I sent out some emails because I wanted to get some experience talking. The truth is, they invited me to speak. I went with a little trepidation. I didn't really know what was going to happen, okay? And I thought it was going to be for the public. It turned out to be, it was a closed meeting of the Secular Student Society. I spoke for about 45 minutes, okay? And I said, and now, please, I want the most important part of the evening, your questions. Dead silence. Now, I've been a teacher, for over 30 years. I know there's different types of silences, and Ramati knows this also, okay? Sometimes there's a silence in the room because you've put everyone to sleep, okay? That's true, it happens once in a while. Sometimes there's a silence because nobody really knows what you're talking about, and their eyes are kind of glazed over, and they're bored, they want to go eat lunch. Sometimes there's a silence because everybody's very uncomfortable, they don't know what to say. You just said, now ask questions, and nobody knows what to say. Finally, one guy sort of raised his hand, very uncomfortably. He said to me like this, he goes, the first question that I was ever asked on this topic, he goes, okay, Rabbi, maybe God did create life. I said, my God, I didn't expect to hear that. He goes, maybe God did create life, but it doesn't prove religion. And I said, you know what? You're absolutely correct. Because God created life does not mean he spoke at Mount Sinai. We'll get to that next time. Okay. Anyway, but thank you for your question. Yes, Ramati.
First, I would just touch on Dovey's point is if there is a creator, then you can't talk about anything as improbable. All you can say is, I wouldn't have done it. It's not improbable. It's, I wouldn't have done it if there is a creator.
Do you hear? You remember you said all the things in the.
My eyes glazed over there. I don't think I'm picking up on that.
If there is an infinite being who's the creator, you can't talk about anything as improbable. All you could say is, I wouldn't have done it.
You were talking about all the things that happened in the Old Testament.
There's no probability there.
Right.
It's, I wouldn't have done it.
Right.
I wouldn't have either done it. That's not right.
Right.
Because we're no longer, once you're talking about a conscious being, you can't talk about, there's no randomness there. I wouldn't have done it. Okay. But I would like to touch on, I think that what we didn't touch on is what are the consequences of the two ideas? Because in the 20th century, what we're looking at is a massive clash. We're in the 21st, I'm saying in the 20th century, a massive clash of what is the result of the two ideas.
You mean atheism versus belief?
Right. In other words,
Right.
what we have is that in the world that is horrified at the Holocaust, what they're saying is the Nazis may be right that there is no creator, but we ought to be acting as if there is. And so what I'm really saying is that what we really have to ask is, what's wrong with turning people into soap if there is no God? You have the consequences of what makes it as well. Because we are all naturally driven with the concept of what I want to do. As a Torah observant Jew, I will do the wrong thing consciously. But we should understand that on the question of what makes it right or wrong to turn people into bars of soap, I would say, posit the idea that there is no God. The Nazis are right. The Jews just hoodwinked us. Now let's understand that everything we've done, morality is irrelevant. Now, if the Jews are right, there is. If not, not.
What about biological reciprocity?
Again, what we're saying is, all that we do consider biology irrelevant. Human beings have nothing against the fact that biology created human beings who have a drive for sex. In order to have babies, we will create condoms. Condoms are not sins against nature. It just takes what it is and do the opposite, because I decide what I do, not nature. I can know that biology created me as a certain machine. I can go against it any time. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with pushing a button and causing the universe to cease to exist if I can do it. If there is no God, you can't describe what's wrong with that.
Right.
Biology is not my God. I can do anything.
Right, and that, I think what Ramati's talking about, that's the section in the book called Atheism and Morality, the implication.
Which I would love to talk about, but that's more of a theological
Right.
conversation. And that's mental masturbation. That's not coming down to the facts of.
Well, I happen
What
to
I'm
think
talking
it,
about is, you're just stuck with the manipulation of the Jews to get you into morality. I can understand, 2,000 years ago, we will go to the Colosseum, watch people kill each other for fun. Nobody had a problem with it. The Jews screwed up with your mind. You gotta understand, there's nothing wrong with it.
But there are non-religious bases for morality.
Of course, like biological reciprocity.
Right.
Understand what that is.
Not even based in biology, but things like utilitarianism. I mean, they're not claiming that there is this universal meta objective morality, but there are things that, there are principles that we can use that will create a world that we would want to live in.
I think,
doing the opposite is just.
I think what Ramati is pointing out is, I'll give you a quote. There was a British writer, a 19th century author by the name of Samuel Butler, and he said the following. He was talking about, from an atheistic world point of view. He said, morality is the custom of one's country and the current feelings of one's peers. Cannibalism is moral in a cannibalistic country. In other words, Tuvia, you're right, you can come up with all kinds of systems, any system you want, except that it doesn't have any significance beyond your own head. In other words, let's say you come up with a system of morality, and I say to you, I have an idea. Instead of me listening to your system, why don't you listen to my system? It's just as good as yours. So in other words, you're right, you can come up with systems. He's pointing out that your system has no real significance. If you want to listen to it, be my guest. You don't want to listen to it, be my guest. It's up to you. Whatever floats your boat, really, is what it boils down to.
God doesn't necessarily make it better, right? Like, even if you assert the existence of God, what compels you to do what God wants?
That's a very good. It's a very good question. And I don't know how patient people are. I could sit here and talk about that all night. But that question is very important. What obligates you to listen to God?
Self-interest.
What?
Self-interest.
Ultimately, in other words, ultimately, because, and again, this doesn't do the subject justice at all. The question is an incredibly important question. The answer is an incredibly important answer. Ultimately, only one thing is that doing what God asks you to do connects you with the only reality of existence that there is, and that's God Himself. Anything else is a connection to nothingness and illusion. If you don't want reality, if you want your illusion, be my guest and live any way you want. If you want reality, if you want what's actually real, then you listen to God. But even that doesn't really do it justice. You really need to work it through. By the way, I'm sure you've ever heard of the Euthyphro dilemma?
Yeah.
Okay, the Euthyphro dilemma, have you ever heard of it? The Euthyphro dilemma is a philosophical challenge that is put out by non-believers to this argument that Rabbi Moshe was talking about morality. Okay? And ultimately, when the answer to the Euthyphro dilemma, and I've got a whole chapter on it in the book, is really the answer to your question. And most people not everybody even realize how important the question is. So if I could tell you, please read the book, okay, and then call me and we can argue about it. We can discuss it, because it really, this really is important. So I'm a little hesitant to go. What do you think?
It's fine. I think,
Anyone else have any comments, questions? Anyone want to bring up anything else?
I think Rabbi Berger had, because there's one of the subjects that he covers so well is, if there's a God, what difference does it make?
Right. Yes.
Which I think we'll have him speak about that in a few weeks, but maybe want to speak about it right now. I don't know.
I feel like I would love to really address Tuesday's question.
Yeah.
I feel like we'd be here for another hour at least, just to really even get into the question. I don't think everyone else is ready to handle that. I don't know if it's appropriate.
Not necessarily tonight.
Yeah. Okay. At any rate, in case anyone wants to buy the book, it's back there. In case I've got a list of articles. If you want to be in touch, I'm more than happy to discuss, to talk. At any rate, everyone. Whether you believe or not, God bless you all. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're here. He's here.
Shama shir shir chadyan